From the heart of Central Florida, you're listening to A Neighbor's Choice. And we're live again for our second of our return to live streaming that we're trying out here on various platforms, wherever you're watching us, whether it's Rumble or X, Facebook, wherever you want to engage with us. Make sure that you stay tuned for more live streams at your preferred platform. We'll be trying to do this more often again. For some of you who don't know, as your host, David Gornoski, I spent many years in terrestrial radio, FM, AM, starting out in WFLA Orlando News Radio on the iHeart station across the Orlando area. And then we added Tampa Bay, WHBO News Talk Florida, Tampa Bay, St. Petersburg, Clearwater, Sarasota, that whole area. And we did the drive time show from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. there. But we started the terrestrial radio show in 2018, I believe. And then we did it as a podcast. We did it as a live stream on various platforms. Our YouTube channel was deleted viciously and savagely by vicious fascists, or what we call book burners. In older times, we call them deranged bots. Now, they were very angry that I was promoting content that was helping people who were suffering from the scourge, the plague that was spreading everywhere at the time, and that was that and a few other things. They would have strike my channel we had live callers on talk radio calling in, and they would strike me for things that callers said. So I guess they were really just angry at anybody having access to free information, like total authoritarian folks that they are. But nevertheless, Facebook, YouTube, they've completely attacked our channel in the past, and we've continued now picking up. Recently, we started X, an account there, and so we're going to see what we can do to test out the boundaries of free speech on that platform and see if it holds the promise that it claims to have as being a bastion of free speech. I think that remains to be seen how far that the whole concept of freedom of speech but not reach, how far does that apply? Does that include criticism of Neuralink? Are you allowed to criticize that, or is that going to be flagged very low, on the algorithm results? These are questions that remain to be seen. Of course, you've always got these things. These things are always in flux, and there's always these different alliances and things when you're dealing with these big oligarchic social media ghettos. But that's why we did terrestrial radio. But we've now pivoted more of the online focus, and I think it will be something that will bear fruit as we continue to get the message out. This is the unique angle that we take here on A Neighbor's Choice, as well as our podcast Things Hidden, which deals with anthropology. So we're going to talk a little bit about why women have a hard time with politics. That's the theme today. But first, I thought this little tweet from Jeff Dice, it's not little, but I'll share a little bit of it. He says, Jeff Dice used to come on my program, since the beginning on terrestrial radio every week, and then even would guest host and fill in for me from time to time. We've had great radio conversations through the years, and off mic too. Great conversations, learning about the nature of current events and where we're at. But he says the politicization of society. This is on X. Insisting every aspect of human life is political is disastrous on many levels. Inflation degrades our financial lives, but politics degrades our personal lives and makes us worse people. It elevates differences of opinion into weapons and voting into proto-war. It makes us suspicious of our neighbors, given the winner-take-all, zero-sum nature of Washington edicts. The costs to simply human goodwill and social cooperation are enormous. This is something I've talked about a lot through the years, that, a lot of conservatives are turning towards these right-wing what I call the little Caesars. They're usually typically very, very small guys, but they love to pine and cry out to God or to whoever to bring them a little Caesar that will save them. They like Napoleon, and they typically look like Napoleons, but they are always looking and craving, please give me a little Caesar, save me, a little Caesar, come and shape up everything. And I understand there's gradients to this stuff, right? There's layers and levels to the level of craving and hungerings for little Caesars that these folks have. But at the end of the day, they typically want to believe that power. A lot of these guys got into, they read a couple Italian political theorists, and they're really excited about feeling like they got the new edgy thing, and so a lot of them tend to try to link this somehow and connect it to their Christian faith, which is a total ridiculous notion of trying to square craving 2,000 years after Jesus goes to the cross, defeats the powers. As Paul says in Corinthians, if they had known what they were doing, the powers wouldn't have crucified Jesus, because it destroyed their power. But yet somehow 2,000 years later, a lot of these folks that say they're Christians didn't get that memo. They didn't read that letter, apparently, or at least they didn't let it saturate them and let it read them, because they failed to make that obvious connection to reality today. That 2,000 years after you've defeated the powers, you don't go crawling back to them saying, please give us a little Caesar king to save us, and imprison our enemies, this kind of stupidity. Now, if you do violent crimes, if you're doing violent crimes, which is very rife in politics, the Clintons, the Epstein, the whole deal, that stuff needs to be obviously punished and shut down and stopped. But the way you get there isn't by, begging and crying out for little Machiavellian, little Napoleon complex fellas to come along and razzle dazzle you and sweep you off your feet. Okay. It's a very feminine posture to be begging for a little Caesar. Unfortunately, these right-wing kids think this is the new thing to do. That doesn't mean, by the way, that I'm somehow into the libertarian thing. There's issues with that I've pointed out many times throughout the years. I'm here to just make common cause with whoever believes in truth, whoever believes in the facts, whoever believes in the understanding of the personhood revolution inaugurated by Jesus 2,000 years ago. And that means we're going to make coalitions with whoever, comes along and directionally in the right direction for peace, against endless wars, against the politicization of society, as Jeff Dice talks about in this post here. When politics, you got to remember, from an anthropological framework, like we talk about on the show a lot, politics is like a container. It contains, with a little dose, it's supposed to be, but it doesn't turn out that way. It's supposed to be a controlled act of coercion and violence to stave off out of control violence. That's the concept behind the origins of religion and the origins of archaic sacred ritual, that we will have a controlled form of coercion and violence so that we don't have out of control, chaotic, mimetic violence, runaway, tit for tat, rivalries causing war of all against all type scenarios. We don't want that, right? So humans over history created little social ordering structures that we call the sacred, that we call religion, which means to bind together. They found ways to bind together based on rituals of controlled violence to stave off profane violence. And not just violence here, but also controlled acts of taboo breaking to prevent out of control, endless, chaotic taboo breaking, right? So that's why in the sacred carnivals, or sacred, what we would call kind of like a sacred festival, you would have a time in which taboos would be indulged in. Taboos would be very widespread. Maybe there'd be a kind of undifferentiation taking place where people would wear masks, where genders would be obliterated in terms of people would wear masks or dress up on the opposite gender, or in a way that would obscure their gender identity. People would, people who had higher rankings and power in the hierarchy of that community would take on a lower position, and the slaves would be elevated to the position of king. Everything was topsy-turvy, right? But that was in a controlled environment. Like, get all your fun out in a controlled ritual, like festival setting, and then the hammer comes down kind of either sometimes at the beginning or at the end of the festival time, where a sacrifice is offered, either a human sacrifice if we go back in earlier times, and then it becomes animal sacrifices. But the human sacrificial ritual, even in cultures in history that ostensibly did away with human sacrifice in its obvious form, of course, still kept doing human sacrifice in indirect ways, whether it was allowing mobs to go and attack and lynch somebody and kill somebody, or, like mob justice type stuff would still brew up in places like the Roman Empire, or war rituals, or, punitive, vicious forms of punishment that were beyond, the level of actually, defending the public, but rather making a spectacle of people's torture and punishment. Those are all forms of sacrificial human human sacrificial ritual continuing, but just in more indirect and subtle ways. Even in societies that said, oh, we have long, stepped out of the role of primitive human sacrifice, still it was bubbling up in different ways. And still to this day, it's happening, which we're going to get into. But all of these things, right, just going to what kind of just continue with what Jeff Dice is saying here, politics is the domain of this. It's the vestige of this sacred space of controlled violence. And, when it invades the politicization of society, when it gets itself into every aspect of our lives, that means it's not being contained. It's violent, coercive, way of trying to resolve our problems, our bad bloods, our envies, our jealousies, our aggressions is seeping out. It's not staying in a contained format. It's becoming total. It's taking over all of our aspects of our lives. And it becomes a part of people's identity more and more so, to the point where it's tearing people's families apart. It's tearing, like you said, it's making us suspicious of our neighbors. You cannot have a functioning society when you destroy that high trust foundation that we have had to some degree and still do have to some degree in various places around America. You have a high trust society where people, I always like to give the illustration of like some of those co-ops that you'll see. And I've seen them not just in the rural communities, but I've seen them in the heart of a city like Tampa, where they have like a farmer co-op, and it's the honor system, right? Where there's a bucket and you put your money in, and then there's a little fridge, and the farmer, you open it up, you get your milk, you get your always for pet food, of course, right? Gotta pay the piper to the oligarchs, take care of them, right? But you have to, have this honor system where you put in your money, you take what you're supposed to take based on the money you put in, and no one's there to count for it. And the money bucket's just sitting there, right? And it kind of functions nicely, right? So we take that for granted so bad. We really take that for granted. Like, we just assume, we're like brats. We just assume that's just the way it's going to be forever. Like, it's just some kind of automatic thing that we're entitled to, but we're not. That takes work. That takes a certain kind of cultural work to keep that kind of thing going. And what really destroys that is what he's talking about, this politicization of everything of our lives. That's a sign that the state is failing. So I'm kind of like not really big on selling you on an ideology about whether it's libertarianism or conservatism or leftism or whatever. I mean, I don't really have a particular favorite term. What I'm trying to get you to see is that the state and its oligarchic allies, that whole central planning system as a model is a relic of the 20th century. It's long past its expiration, and it's continuing to fall apart. And the more people try to like revivify it with some kind of new Nietzschean, Caesar dream or whatever, right-wing politics, fantasizing about Trump, being Batman with JFK, coming out of the shadows or something like JFK Jr. or whatever, like all this stuff, the more people kind of believe in this fantasy and keep it going and all of its different ideological versions, the harder the fall will be, the more chaotic the transition to something next will be. And so it's kind of almost what I'm making is a kind of utility or a kind of pragmatic appeal, whether you're a libertarian, a statist, leftist, conservative, whatever, this system isn't holding. And it's something that is particularly not holding in countries that are what I call Christ haunted. Those are cultures that have long had a dominant tradition of being relatively familiar with the stories of the Bible and the kind of undermining effect that they have on myth making in societies and the undermining that they have on collective violence and scapegoating. You just think about this for one moment. If all societies are found, just this, I know I'm assuming an argument here, but if you watch the show, you know how it's made. But if all societies are basically founded on basically a form of Romulus versus Remus as a myth, so Romulus kills Remus and then he founds the Roman Empire on the murder of his brother, and it's considered to be a good thing. But with the Bible, you have Cain killing Abel, but the camera stays on the position of Abel and says, hey, his blood cries out for justice. The camera doesn't stay that way in any other tradition. Any other tradition, I don't care. There's ascetic traditions. There's all kinds of nonviolent things that come out of things like the Jains or other traditions that have insights about nonviolence and detachment. But nothing really penetrates and reverses human myth making like the biblical tradition. So societies that have been steeped in that kind of thing for 2,000 years are going to have a certain kind of feel, a certain kind of vibe, a certain kind of awareness of the Abels of their world, right? Another way to look at it is the story of Joseph. Of all societies are based on the Hercules slaughtering the monsters. But with Joseph, within the book of the Genesis, Joseph is this guy who is attacked, he's blamed, he's accused, he's thrown into a ditch by his brothers out of envy. Remember, envy is not something people like to talk about. Even the ancients didn't want to talk about envy. They wanted to keep it quiet because it invites all kinds of rivalry. If you say, hey, you're jealous of me, what does that do? That puts a target on your back the moment you identify it, even if you're right or wrong. And if you say, I'm jealous of you, then that creates another kind of, rivalry, right? That, the fact that someone would even admit that publicly, okay, now, these are things that we don't want to talk about because it has to do with desire. It has to do with the basic things about what makes us human. We talk about this in different ways today, like identity politics. We use words like that. But these are really kind of downstream vestiges of something much more fundamental that the Bible reveals about human nature. But Joseph is someone who's thrown in the ditch, and the camera stays with Joseph's perspective. It doesn't stay with the winners of that conflict. Let that be clear. History written by the winners, yes, but with the big asterisks that when you look at that, the Bible inverts that. It doesn't invert that as some kind of ideological revolutionary catastrophe in which it reverses that through violence. So that's why you can look through the history of the church and see examples in which the church is making, alliances with a kind of winner's view of history where, we get to smite our enemies and throw them off cliffs and engaging in that. But it's easy for us to see that 2,000 years after, right? This whole process of the personhood revolution begins in history. And then you got to understand these things are there's a concept in the Eastern church tradition called theosis, which often is talked about on a personal level, about the idea of becoming more, like God through your life. But I think needs to be understood on a human species level as well. that you can't go back and look at earlier periods of your life and say, well, man, as an 8-year-old, I really, that was the peak of my Christian maturity or my moral development. And now I'm way worse. Like that wouldn't be, but yet people tend to do that on the right. They'll pick a period of time in history and they'll say, oh, that was the glory days. We should go back to that. And that's like going back to humanity's teenage years or humanity's, maybe we're still in the teenage years of the Homo sapiens species, but this is like this idea of like trying to go back in time and find, well, this was when I was peak humanity. Let's just try to replay that. That doesn't work that way. Okay. That's the fundamental mistake of the right-wing assumption about history. And then you have the same kind of thing going on with the more left-wing approach, which is always having this haughty, condemnatory attitude about the things of the past. Like, well, they're so bigoted and all this stuff. And again, it's like, well, how can you, at whatever age you are as an adult, judge, the actions and the things you were thinking about when you were 12 or 16 or 22 or whatever it is, right? So there's a process that's taking place, this theosis of the human species taking place. And it's revealing the way in which we do things and allowing us to have more self-awareness and species awareness, hence anthropology of the Bible, right? Becoming aware of who we are as a species is a process. And we're slow on it. We are more likely to be aware of the ways in which differentiation can sometimes exclude people rather than we are to renounce our claim on the holiness of sacred violence. Remember that. And so there's a lag there. We are aware of the injustices that sometimes happens with differentiation and certain types of boundaries and certain types of hierarchies than we are to recognize the immorality of scapegoating violence. We are very slower on that, but we still are aware of some of the brutality of violence, and we always just try to come up with more sterile or passive aggressive forms of violence, like telling people to take the greatest drug that ever lived because it will save your grandma, even though it's hurting your grandma. Probably it's isolating your grandma with the, putting them in a room where nobody else can see them, torturing them in that way, and then giving you a drug that's a terrible, horrible, disastrous joke of a solution. But see, that's a passive aggressive way of using violent collective coercion, right? It's not as direct. In the old days, before the Christ consciousness that is starting to more and more saturate the earth as the water is wet in the ocean, that saturation process is making us more and more aware of who we are as a species, which is what Jesus inaugurated in history for a reason. And that's why I don't like the trad move that a lot of folks make, and I'm not going to go down too far with that, where they're obsessed with hiding in their prayer closet, talking about how wicked they are. That's not what Jesus did. This notion that, that's the way we're supposed to emulate. I mean, this idea of hiding and retreating and just, woe is me, I'm such a miserable person. Whoa. Well, Jesus doesn't spend his time doing that. He spends his time actually helping people just like you and I. And still, the human species is still trying to wrap their minds around his personhood revolution, this inauguration of this new way of having self-awareness of the human species and then making right choices together, both individually and societally. We're still trying to work our minds around this. And that's the way Jesus did, because he wanted us to be co-participants in creation. He wants us to reclaim our viceroy position with the Dominion Mandate. The Dominion Mandate is not to say we're going to lose, let's just be excited for death. That is a total Gnostic misunderstanding of what he did, okay? And we're not going to go down there today. That's for another time. But I'm saying all of this to set the table for why, and this is something that we'll only scratch the surface with, but we'll try to sketch out a few ideas today. Why women have a hard time with politics. So with all of that laid out, look at what we have today, where we see these polls consistently showing that women, particularly single women, are, catastrophically in favor of, what we would say to be the worst political positions available in politics in America today. They're consistently going into this war hawk thing where they're supporting all the dumbest, wicked wars most of the time. That's the party of Biden. I mean, look. Let me give an example. Like Nikki Haley seems to have a lot of, they say she's got some currency with women voters in the Republican primary. And what does she represent? The most extreme level of violence and brutality promised in the political options. What? And the same thing you look at with the Democrats. They're always pushing for, nuclear war with Russia, all this stuff with the Middle East, Syria. They want more stuff done in Syria, regime change there. They want more, some of them on the Democrat side, seems like, especially with Biden, are very hawkish on Iran, Yemen, all these different places, all meddling. And of course, meddling comes with death, destruction, mayhem. And why are women supporting this? And why are women supporting the wrong position on foreign policy in terms of majority? I know it's not everybody, but we're talking about the majority consistently going along with this stuff. Married women tend to be they tend to be sometimes majority, a little bit more in a more conservative direction. Of course, there's a lot of problems with that too. So from the outset, voting in general is very suspicious, right? It's very we would not be very high on political options with voting. I've criticized that whole endeavor in and of itself. But why is it that the women tend to be seemingly the biggest hardcore base of this woke project, of the warmongering, Murder Inc. project, the stupid, open status borders policies, where you're treating human beings like pets? There's a lot of reasons, but I'll sketch out a couple reasons. Going back first to what I said there about the hauntedness, the Christ hauntedness of our society. Women have a vibe. They understand how to pick up social cues. They're very socially intelligent. That's the way they're designed. And very socially intelligent, very socially aware of what the tribe and what's going on, very socially tuned in to the vibe. The idea of that saying, read the room, right? This is a telling word that a lot of women like to use, but also just explains the kind of strength that women have, oftentimes more so than men, which is this keen awareness of reading the collective vibe. Where are we at here? And in that way, that's, I think, why they are more in tune with the propaganda of the media that's coming out of the Western oligarchs for their war campaigns, for their campaigns for garbage medicine, whether it's to deal with acute diseases like we just had to deal with, that absolute disaster, or whether it's the chronic classics that are making hundreds of billions of dollars for corrupt criminal medical corporations. Oftentimes it's the women that have the highest support for the most draconian things. And it's because they read the room. They read the room, they feel the vibes of the Christ-haunted atmosphere of our culture. They're very acutely aware of the emotional flavor of our society that has been haunted by the notion that God dies on the cross and that God stands on the side of the person who's been marginalized on the cross, on the basically the trash dump of the society, outside of the inner sanctum, outside of the place of privilege and wealth and coziness and holiness, but left to die, abandoned by even his own followers, most of them at least, but even the ones that were there not really saying much, right? And this is the aesthetic, this is the image that has been seared into the consciences of us in the West. Whether we rebel against the metaphysical claims of the church that aesthetic, the art, the vibe, the feeling is still deeply, deeply saturated in our spirits and in the room. So women read the room of the West, and it feels like a house with Christ haunted reminders. When you look in the mirrors, you see the cross. You look out into the dark hallway, you see what looks like a martyr, right? And that kind of vibe is very easily, the psychopaths are very smart at reading rooms too, in a different way, right? Sociopaths and psychopaths very good at reading the rooms in a calculated way to gain power. And so it makes sense that when you have so much concentration of power in centralized government and centralized oligarchic corporations, that they can easily figure out, okay, we understand how we can weaponize the foundational things like the maternal instinct, especially for single women that are told, do not get married. That's a sign that you're low status. So you want to be high status, it means you need to mimetically compete to being a man. You need to outman the man in every type of classical metric that men typically compete in. And then there's the child rearing thing, which is kind of treated like this kind of embarrassing relic of a previous era of humanity before it was emancipated by modern scientism and Gnostic statism, or whatever labels we want to throw at this nonsense that we're under in the West. But this is what they're doing. They're reading the room and they're saying, wait a second, the maternal instinct kicks in. We can play on that against women. We can show people in really horrible situations needing to migrate out of countries, most of which they got those very women and men to vote for some type of power to give the government to wage these regime change coups and chaos operations around the globe that creates the destructive environment that makes people want to flee en masse. So that's a factor. That's the irony there. But this is not logically spelled out by any, mass media outlet. Very rarely do you have any of this message being heard in the broad scale, media outlets and radio, or NPR doesn't talk about this. The sausage making of how people are displaced, wanting to, come to America by the millions. Most of it's our foreign policy, but that's not connected. But there's this maternal instinct to say, hey, you're chasing, you got to chase your career. Anytime you're not, beating men at the top of managerial positions, that's a sign that you've been oppressed. So it's not your fault. Just keep trying, keep voting for leftist, globalist policies. Keep voting for people who just flood the country with millions and millions of people without even having any kind of order or structure to the situation. And what does that do? That creates the chaos that we see today. That creates a balkanization that lowers the trust between neighbors, like we talked about, that makes things more zero sum, right? Is that in order for me to win, I've got to take someone else down. That's sacrificial language right there, right? So it's the breakdown of sacrificial violence that is spilling out and making everything corrupted and everything more violent and more aggressive that we're watching happen. And the psychopaths that run government and do propaganda with their media partners understand how to weaponize the maternal instinct, how to weaponize the read the room power that women have to feel like, they're very keen to the emotional resonance of the aesthetic and the ethical, empathy that comes with being a Christ-haunted nation, a nation that may not be living up to the call of the cross, but still very much is schooled in a lot of the stories and meanings subconsciously. You got to remember Hollywood, even in its, debased and cheap pop culture movies and stupid plot lines, it still is saturated with, these messages about that are basically straight from the Bible, stories about inverting the sacrifices of the past, or, rejecting tit for tat aggression, or, inverting what is considered to be a villain and what is considered to be a good guy. Because the gospel gives you that kind of suspicion. The gospel tells you what Romulus did, what the story of Rome will tell you was a just murder the story of Genesis tells you was an unjust murder. What mythologies around the world will tell you are monsters to be destroyed, the gospel says actually in a slow anthology, through the anthology of the books in the Bible, it shows you that there's this process in which you start to realize, wait a second, sometimes the monsters that we're sold on are actually not monsters, they're human persons like me. And that's the vibe. That's the feeling of the West. And women are in tune with that. And psychopaths know that. And they are able to prey on that by playing up babies in incubators for the Persian War, the first Persian Gulf War, or the propaganda they used in Syria, he's gassing people, when it looks like our terrorist partners in that conflict that were doing that horrible killing of civilians. Whether it's whatever different scenario, that they're always selling us on the next war scam. Afghanistan, all of these things, right? It's always dressed up in this Christ-haunted type vibe. That's what they know sells. And that's how they are able to do a number on a lot of women voters and women's minds and affections. Same thing with the drag queen story time and putting the stories that are explicit in children's libraries in every school. Again, who's the largest block of people who are going to be supporting that? Typically women. Why? Especially single women. Why? There's a lot of reasons there, but from a deeper anthropological level, a Christ-haunted level, folks who are interested in those types of drag, displays and that kind of thing, transgender dynamics, in classical societies and historic societies, traditional societies, were not celebrated as something to be emulated in the normalcy of everyday life. Because they would do, like I said, gender swap stuff would happen in the carnival time. But now, because the sacred has been destroyed, the return of the sacred tries to make another play to make every day a carnival. All society, normalcy becomes carnivalistic and undifferentiated. And so women feel that vibe, and they can vibe with it, right? They can emotionally resonate with, wow, this person was not, and a lot of these people, like I've mentioned before, don't look, these guys that are dressing up as women, they don't look very, they're not sending their best, right? They're not sending, these are not, so they send these little misfits in, and then the women feel like, hey, look, see, don't tell me they're rejects. Those people can be seen as beautiful and courageous too. That's a very Christ-haunted feeling that's been misdirected by psychopaths that don't want human beings to have healthy families and healthy neighborhoods and healthy fertility. Do you see what I mean? Same thing with the whole body positivity thing, where they trot out people who are severely in bad health. And they say, this is great, just stay that way. Well, I've talked about the other extreme where the right, these little thin, little skinny, small, short little fellas, so obsessed with talking about everybody's weight, but they worship Donald Trump. But then on the left, you've got this other part of the dialectic, and we can always typically reject the dialectic if we're Christians and adults, okay? Just that's a shorthand. But on the other side of the dialectic, this body positivity of women who are severely, or men, but they do this a lot with targeting women, very, very overweight people who have been seed oil poisoned. And they don't tell people on Vogue magazine or Vanity Fair or whatever they're reading today at TikTok, it's the seed oils causing this, stop this and do this thing and do that thing to try to have healing properly from this stuff. They just say, just embrace it, right? And so women feel the vibe, and they feel that, well, yeah, those people in previous times when in the 80s or 90s would have been picked on more. What a great champion. Now we can celebrate these people. They don't have to be picked on. They don't have to be marginalized. They have to be, the right stupidly just says, let's go back to the 80s and throw eggs at some, heavy woman, or, make fun of her, put ketchup in her seat in the bus. That's those stupid people, right? They're dumb, okay? And they make a joke out of Christianity. They make a joke out of their whole gimmick. They're a waste of time. They're the chihuahuas. We don't need to hear from them. Of course, they're elevated by the algorithm because they're useful controlled opposition. Even though they, always try to act like they're calling out the controlled opposition, they're just another layer of controlled opposition. But the gospel penetrates through all the stupidity, all the foolishness here, okay, on both sides of the dialectic. But women see this overweight person and they say, hey, she used to be picked on. I know a girl like that, and when I was in high school or college or middle school, and they were picked on, and now we can celebrate. Yeah, you're beautiful. Go out there and make music, and don't you dare be told by anybody that you might be actually severely poisoned by your food supply. And then you look at the food supply and you say, well, why is that? Why are women the ones who are most likely to be eating a plant-based diet? Because again, it's a Christ-haunted move that psychopaths and oligarchs take advantage of. Don't hurt the animals. If you're told, hey, you can be healthier if you eat flaxseed oil, which causes cellulitis, or not cellulite, probably does that too, but cellulite, and it causes all these other horrific things, inflammatory effects in your body, but you don't know that. You're told this is what makes you healthy. And then you're told, and here's the other bigger thing, you can be morally more upright than your neighbor who's tearing into the flesh of a cow. Have you seen little cows? They're beautiful. Who would want to do that, right? So you can be higher status, and we're going to get to that point too. You can be higher status, more morally upright, and healthier. So women want to do that. Women read the room. And that goes, you can walk this through all these different little things that women are typically being sold the most in our society. And we have a commenter, Gokata says, when you understand the instinct of a creature, you can control it. Women and men need to become more self-aware. Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing that, I'm thinking maybe I should write something up more about this. Because we need to have this conversation, and it needs to not be in the dumb silo approach that it typically goes, right? You get the trad people that just say the solution is sourdough bread and taking Instagram photos of you, putting your hand on wheat through a field. And it's stupid, and then you have the folks who, they're really big into pushing their little religious niche. Oh, it's this religion, it's my particular little nook of Christendom that is the true way and nobody else. And I get so tired of that stuff too. I get tired of that. That's a total waste of time. Partisanship has no place in the true gospel. Doesn't have partisanship, doesn't have Pharisee, holier than thou nonsense. But yeah, so every little major theme where you see women leading the charge in terms of the political or cultural vibe, you can just see how it's a Christ-haunted kind of move that's being made, and women are keen on that. Typically, they're more emotionally resonant than the average guy on that type of thing. They feel the collective environment. That's how they were designed. And then there's the other factor here that's, you layer this right on the whole package, the maternal instinct being misdirected, there's the being emotionally resonant with the Christ vibe of the room of the Western society. There's the other issue of kind of the status sensitivity, which kind of goes right alongside with reading the vibe, which is, and people talk about this with war brides, how women, were evolved to socially through the years that, if there's a raiding army, they come in, they take over, and they switch out, they kill your husband, they kill everybody and they capture you, put you on a ship, and now you're a new religion and a new culture, new language, new customs, new habits. And you had to basically be able to switch on a dime your affections and go with where the power was. Now, the red pill type community tries to play into that. Oh, look how pernicious and dark this is and all this stuff. It's just a fact. It's just a fact that is an effect of the fall, really, right? And that's not. I mean, the war bride concept is a great way to explain it, but it's not really the deeper explanation there. It goes back to the foundations of the hominization of human beings and the rivalry that happens between, the male and the man and the woman since the beginning. But there is a factor there, right? Which is that, when you, when you realize that all the cool kids, meaning all of what is socially in normal society, I'm not talking about people who are checked out, and going in a different thing, but when all your Instagram influencers, when all your TikTok biggest accounts, when all of the Hollywood, these are not as powerful, but they still have currency. The Hollywood stars, the music stars, Taylor, when all these people, right? When they're all vibing in a certain direction, right? Go for the guy who wants the wars. Go for the people who say body positivity. Go for the people who say flood the country with millions of people. That's care. All of these are plays on hijacking the Christian, aesthetic that they're vibing with, but they're also indicators of who's got the power. And the left and all those institutions still, even though they're losing rapidly their legitimacy, they have a lot of power. And they may be very more exposed as corrupt and hypocritical than ever before, but they're still in power. They're still running the thing, and they're still in power, often largely because the right still is more obsessed with imitating the left's lust for power than actually following Jesus in the dismantling of power through proactive social aikido. So they don't understand what they're up against. The right doesn't understand. So they come up with these dumb little reactionary takes, and they get rewarded from it. Like they get lots of likes or little hot take that goes viral where they say something naughty about women or whatever. And then guess what? They feel like they've succeeded because they did a little class clown move where you say something, the teacher says, "Hey, what are you doing? Stand up. You go to the principal's office," and you get a few, laughters, right? Giggles. The right-wing little troll says, "Oh, look, I've got attention. My little reactionary dialectical reaction to the people in power, it got some attention. That means I'm effective." No, it's not. You're useless. You're just feeding the machine. You're not learning how to actually be a leader, be a man, and learn how to lead the society to the future. That is a more attractive place where power can naturally, organically flow towards, and a much more healthier form of power, a much more healthier form of hierarchy and differentiation. So women just read the room. They feel the vibe of Christ hauntedness better on average, and that is what the propagandists prey on through their marketing and news-making stories. And they also know where the power goes. And so when you have two people, let's say the leftist culture and this right-wing culture, and they're vying for power, and one says, we're going to put you in prison for sharing a Hillary Clinton meme, and we're going to arrest you for protesting at an abortion mill, and we're going to throw the book at you if you go to the January 6th thing, and if you're a left-wing person burning cities, you're fine. We'll pay for your bail, and we'll gleefully do it with joy. And then you have this right-wing little counterfact said, "Well, wait till we get our little Caesar in there, and we're going to do that too. We're going to arrest you guys. We're going to outlaw. We're going to have blasphemy laws. We're going to have all this stuff." Women intuitively feel the BS, man. They get it. They say, "You're talking a big thing. Maybe you have a little skinny tie on. Maybe you're trying to look cool, but you're still try hard. You don't have the power, and you're just imitating a cheap ripoff with a little bit of a spin. The hypocrisy, the love of violence, the love of tyranny and nihilism, ultimately, that the folks in power already do. So why would I go with you when the real power, alpha in the move is still a leftist cadre of oligarchs and institutions? So that's why they go with that, right? So this is not an easy thing you can fix overnight, but being aware of it, how it works, how the right wing and all of its different iterations basically feeds into this stalemate that continues to trend women more and more into the hands of psychopath oligarchs and their narratives. This will continue until what I'm saying and the Christian approach starts to actually permeate and resonate with the broader culture. And there's a reason why they shadow banned. They tried to drown the baby of A Neighbor's Choice in the bathtub, right? They tried to drown this baby as they didn't, like, you know, like Rosemary's Baby that's how they treated my stuff, the establishment. Okay. This thing's too powerful. Let's try. And it's also because it's a little bit ahead of its time, but this is too powerful. Let's shut his YouTube channel down. Let's, block him on Facebook, algorithm this, algorithm that, whatever. People try to get me off radio stations, didn't work. But they've been trying to do that from the beginning because they know this message is more powerful than any of the cheap, ripoffs that you have algorithmically boosted today. So that's just a little bit of a sketch about why women have a hard time with politics. We'll try to flesh this out further in future conversations, but we'll leave it there for now. Something to chew on. Remember, just to review, the maternal instinct being hijacked, the vibe, the emotionally resonant vibe, the reading the room that women typically are good at, hijacked when it's sensitive to Christ-haunted, narratives and feelings and stories and photos and videos and all that rhetoric, all that Christ-haunted stuff redirects towards tyranny in the hands of oligarchs, and women are getting hit by that all the time. They're more sensitive to that. 3, knowing where the power is, knowing who's got the real leadership, and the right wing offering nothing but cheap little, like, try hard ripoffs of what the left does. Okay. So those are those are 3 starting points for understanding why we have this trend, particularly with single women. You can get into other things. You can get into other layers of this, like the birth control pill. What does that do to single women when they're on that, or women in general? What does that do to their mind? What does that do with their mind? You can look at seed oils. Seed oils are linked to a lot of mental health problems in the literature. Omega-6 inflammation, what does that do? You can look at depression, that's connected there with seed oil consumption, birth control, but you can look at abortion. You can see, okay, this is this founding myth. Remember I talked about Romulus and Remus, the founding myth of Rome. Well, what's the founding myth of this feminist or girl power political enterprise that has captured so many, tens of millions of people? It's the founding myth that says abortion is healthcare, using a euphemism, just like in the ancient world, they would say the gods have decreed that this is a noble and beautiful thing, that we should rip the heart out of this, little peasant boy or girl and feed it to the gods so that the sun would rise. Now the downstream is abortion, which is killing, a child in the womb, is now called healthcare. Health means you're healthy. Well, abortion's not a healthy thing to do. It's not. It's actually linked to a lot of diseases like breast cancer increasing. And then care. Care is the opposite of killing, right? But they use these kind of totalitarian words to hide with mythic language, obfuscate the violence so that people go along with this. And this is kind of the founding murder that continues on and on and on. That is the foundation of this kind of nihilistic, women's political movement of the dominant leftist culture. So that has to be addressed as well. So we'll leave it there for now, and I hope that's helpful for you. And you can email me, hello@aneighborschoice.com, with your comments and thoughts. I'm David Gornoski. Godspeed.